This is the second, or kind of fourth, video in a series, so go watch the first video, or at least the intro to it, before watching this one. I went a little out of order, so that video should have all the context you need for this one. With that, I'm just gonna jump right into the episode. We open at a Renaissance fair in 1985. TVA agents, led by the hunter C20, are here for a variant which their tech detected. They don't know who it is, despite the fact that last episode, their tech did show them who the variant was. Not sure why that's not a thing anymore. They follow the signal into a tent. A hand comes out of the darkness to turn C20's eyes green, which I'm just gonna skip ahead and spoil. That means she is being mind-controlled by this mysterious variant. For no reason at all, she takes off her helmet, drops her prune stick, then goes to knock out another agent hand to hand. If this is her goal, why not just use the prune stick? That's a much faster and easier option that got discarded for no reason. She picks up one of the prop lances, which, again, is worse than a prune stick, then takes out another agent with the help of the variant this time. For the next agent, she seems to catch him off guard, even though he's standing a few feet away and facing towards her. She overtakes him, but the mind control wears off and she passes out. Then the agent sees the variant and stabs at them, which seems to get dodged. He could just have shifted his stabbing motion to the side as the variant dodged, because prune sticks don't need any significant amount of force to work at all. All he needs is to just barely touch the variant. But instead, he kept with the straight stabbing motion despite the variant dodging all the way to beside him. And on the variant's part, that was a close call with being pruned that was unnecessary. C20 had this guy about to be pruned, but delayed, then stopped being controlled. And all of this would have gone much smoother if not for the variant making C20 drop her prune stick. Then the variant grabs the reset charges off of him. Why are they bringing at least 2 reset charges here, and maybe more in that bag? 1 is all they need at any given time, and they know that agents have been getting killed and having their reset charges stolen.
Reset charge is gone.
It's unbelievably incompetent that they bring unnecessary reset charges for no reason other than to risk them being stolen. In fact, they don't even need to bring any at first. Just deal with the variant, then have someone portal in with a charge, so that if dealing with the variant goes south, they're not having any more reset charges stolen, because that could lead to disastrous consequences. Well, technically, we'll get there. The variant grabs C20 and walks away through the portal they made. By the way, I didn't mention this in my first video, but the variant has a tempad and can use it with no difficulty. I guess the TVA put no sort of security system on their tech that could be most dangerous in the wrong hands. No biometric authenticator or even a simple passcode? Then we get the absolute banger of an opening theme. After that, we pick up to Lowkey being tested on his knowledge of the TVA training material he's been going through, and we learn about the Red Line, something that was briefly mentioned last episode.
The branch is nearing Red Line. We need to go.
Here, Miss Minutes asks Lowkey,
what happens when a Nexus event branches past Red Line?
And after a sarcastic response, she prods the real answer out of him.
It's when the TVA can no longer reset a Nexus event.
So when any branch reaches that point, that branch is there forever, and the TVA can't do anything about it. Well, until Season 2 contradicts that, but for now, that's how it is. This means that in the entire history of the TVA, despite their clear incompetence and lack of capabilities, no branch has ever reached the Red Line. No slip-up big enough to cause that has ever happened, even with this variant running around wreaking havoc. Sure. Miss Minutes follows up with,
and that would lead to the destruction of the timeline and the collapse of reality as we know it.
Which is a strange way of putting it. Yes, that will happen, but only indirectly. The direct result would be multiversal war that causes the aforementioned destruction. But either way, this means branches reaching the Red Line is very, very bad news. and any chance of this happening should be treated with utmost urgency, because otherwise, you're risking multiversal war which will destroy everything. Loki then asks,
Can you hear me?
which is a dumb question. She reacted to his sarcastic answer.
Very bad things.
Come on, Loki.
So she very clearly can hear him. Mobius shows up, gives him a jacket, then brings him to the briefing of their next mission. B-15 explains the context of the mission and how
We've grabbed enough temporal aura to know it's our Lowkey variant, but which kind of Lowkey remains unknown.
which is a strange line considering something we learn later this season, but we'll get to that. Loki says,
They're the lesser kind, to be clear.
and B-15 responds,
Let me see the back of that jacket.
and they go on bickering. Didn't the prior scene just establish that you should want to deal with this as fast as possible? Because if the branch reaches the red line, you are irreversibly doomed to multiversal war? Mobius interrupts to get things back on track and says,
When we get out on the branch, we're not just looking for a time criminal, we're looking for a Lowkey.
which they already know. B-15 just said that. Redundancy is not helping you get to your highly urgent task. He's talking about the differences that Loki variants can have, saying,
Slight differences in appearances, or not so slight.
which doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because the whole red line thing is never directly explained, but given what we're shown, the only viable explanation for what the units a branch passes on its way to the red line are, is that they are measures of how different the branch is, which is extremely nebulous, but it's what the show seems to want to quantify with them. So if a branch ever gets too different from the Sacred Timeline, that will make it redline, which means multiversal war. So again, no branch in the history of the TVA has ever made it past the red line. If the Avengers being in New York for like an hour makes the branch near redline, or later this episode we see that the variant and TVA being at a Renaissance fair for like a few hours at most does the same, how could it possibly be the case that a Lowkey has developed so differently as to look like this, or have different powers, without the branch being different enough to have hit the red line already? For him to have different physiology, he would have to be born differently. Then, what, he just lives to be an adult as shown in the projection, and nothing has changed significantly enough for the TVA to catch notice of it before that point, or for the branch to redline? For him to have different powers, he would have to either have been born differently and learned to use those different powers over his whole lifespan, or at a certain point, he learned different witchcraft or something, both of which would cause changes over long periods of time that would require differences bigger than the differences that we see cause a red line. So none of what he's talking about here should be possible. Also, if he describes Lowkey variants as
A type we should all be very familiar with because the TVA has pruned a lot of these guys, almost more than any other variant.
then why is he briefing them on this? It should be common knowledge at the TVA, and you're just wasting time letting this branch inch closer to the red line, re-explaining it to these people who should already know it well. As Mobius is listing the powers Loki usually has, Loki interrupts him.
Shape-shifting, illusion, projection, and my
Duplication
favorite,
casting.
And surely Loki isn't correcting him because illusion projection is a power Loki has. So I guess he just said this to add duplication casting to Mobius's list? Even though Mobius wasn't done yet. That could have been the one he was about to say was his favorite. Mobius doubles down,
illusion projection.
but Loki clarifies with such pretentious nonsense of a run-on sentence that I'm going to have to tackle it in parts for fear of getting caught by Content ID.
Illusion projection involves depicting a detailed image from outside oneself which is perceptible in the external world.
That's a lot of words to say that illusion projection is making an illusion of something that is not yourself. Saying it's perceptible in the external world already follows in that it is a detailed image from outside oneself. The world is outside oneself, and images have to be perceptible, otherwise they wouldn't be images. He contrasts this against duplication casting, which he describes as
Recreating an exact facsimile of one's own body in its present circumstance, which acts as a true holographic mirror of its molecular structure.
which is a lot of words to say making an illusion clone of yourself. A true holographic mirror to its molecular structure? Loki's clones of himself don't physically exist. Their molecular structure doesn't matter at all. They're an illusion, just like his other illusions. As someone who loves to argue semantics, this line is pointless semantics to the highest degree, plus redundancy added on for good measure. These two supposedly different powers achieve the same effect. It's just that one of them is to make a fake version of your current self, and the other is to make a fake version of anything else. That's such a pointless and arbitrary distinction. The power to project illusions of anything includes the power to project an illusion of yourself as you are at this current moment. This line seems to be born out of Loki's flowery language that he shares with other Asgardian characters. Except the difference is that the dialogue used to actually be well written. You know what? It's really early into the video and in the middle of a scene, but I don't care. I'm doing a One Marvelous Scene segment right now to show how Loki's dialogue has been absolutely decimated. We're going to pick up immediately after the scene I praised in my video on episode 1. Nat, Cap, and Tony are in the Quinjet taking Loki to the helicarrier after he surrendered. There's a thunderstorm happening around them, which Loki cautiously looks out at, causing Cap to ask him,
"What's the matter? Scared of a little lightning?"
Because such a reaction is not expected of Loki due to the unbreachable confidence he showed before. His response is,
"I'm not overly fond of what follows."
A line that fits how he speaks, yet is straight to the point. The lightning is not something he's scared of or particularly off-put by, but Thor is a more formidable annoyance than anyone here. So he's not overly fond of the idea of him showing up. Thor grabs him and flies off. Tony and Steve have some great dialogue here, but my focus is going to be on Thor and Loki's conversation, because it's some really amazing dialogue that anything in the show pales in comparison to. Thor's first question is,
"Where is the Tesseract?"
as that is the most pressing matter right now. But Loki jovially responds,
I missed you too.
He keeps up his wittiness throughout any situation, and feels no pressure to answer Thor, because he's not intimidated by him in the slightest. Thor isn't having it though.
"Do I look to be in a gaming mood?"
Not until Endgame. Oh wait, that's not what he meant. Thor has multiple important things on his mind right now. The Tesseract being in the hands of Loki, then possibly someone else, could lead to dire consequences. And he is talking to his brother who is back from the dead. Right now, he can't take a joke. Especially one that delays him putting the Tesseract into the right hands. But Loki goes on taunting him.
"Oh, you should thank me."
Flipping the situation on its head, then following up with a line that serves multiple purposes.
"With the Bifrost gone, how much dark energy did the Allfather have to muster to conjure you here?"
On one front, it acknowledges continuity from the first Thor movie, and provides an explanation for how Thor can be here in this one. Yes, the Bifrost was destroyed, but Thor was able to be sent here by Odin's magic, with Loki's wording implying that it was a difficult feat to take up, even for Odin. Thus showing the importance of Thor's mission to stop Loki and bring him back. This wasn't something that could be left alone. But additionally, Loki is facetiously acknowledging that through this, he gave Odin enough of a reason to send Thor back here. Something Thor must have wanted on some level because it's
your precious Earth.
Through this joke about how Thor should be thankful that Loki gave Odin a reason to send him here, he is taking a jab at Thor's care for Earth, something Loki finds silly due to his view of it as backward or lesser. Seeing that Loki doesn't want to take this seriously, Thor drops Mjolnir to go and grab him, bringing up something that surely is serious enough to change Loki's mood.
"I thought you dead."
But even when presented with such a tragedy that his brother faced, Loki is unfazed, continuing to taunt him.
"Did you mourn?"
A mocking question which cuts so deep as a jab that Thor has no choice but to pretend it wasn't one and answer it sincerely.
"We all did."
Continuing to try to steer the conversation so that Loki has to take it seriously, but as he goes on,
"Our father."
Loki throws another wrench in the conversation.
"Your father."
Which causes Thor to wordlessly let go of him. It's unbelievable to Thor that Loki would say this. Loki walks away with,
He did tell you my true parentage, did he not?
As after finding out that he was a frost giant, Loki no longer saw himself as a son of Odin. Thor tries to reason with him after this.
We were raised together. We played together. We fought together.
They've shared basically their whole lives. He doesn't understand how Loki could be so cold and even reject Odin as his father, despite being raised by Odin, as much an Odin son as Thor was. He asks,
Do you remember none of that?
so Loki turns back to give what he thinks is a more accurate recounting of events. No longer joking around, as he sees it as insulting that Thor would describe it this way.
I remember a shadow. Living in the shade of your greatness.
After the events of Thor, Loki's view of Asgard has soured, to the point where he looks back and only sees where he was denied. Thor being the one chosen to be king, and in Loki's eyes clearly being Odin's favorite, which must have been because he himself was, in his words,
No more than another stolen relic.
His recounting doesn't end here though. He continues with,
I remember you tossing me into an abyss.
which is not what happened either. He was falling because of his own attempt to stop Thor from saving the frost giants, only for Loki to choose to let go. But much like the memories of their childhood, his bitterness twisted this event to be Thor's doing. Another part of Asgard's purposeful rejection of him. And all of this was done to Loki of all people.
I who was and should be king.
His anger heightened by his entitlement stemming from seeing himself as a far more worthy ruler than Thor. Throughout this, Thor's face continued to show hurt and confusion, shocked by what his brother has become. He responds with,
So you take the world I love as recompense for your imagined slights.
as Loki's summary of what happened was not at all what truly happened, but Loki himself reacts to this description in much the same way Thor has been reacting this whole time. How dare he describe this as imagined slights? But before he can get a word out, Thor says,
No, the earth is under my protection, Loki.
a statement so absurd to Loki that just like that, he's back to being sarcastic, laughing as he sees another opportunity to degrade Thor.
And you're doing a marvelous job with that.
As he described in the prior scene, he sees humanity's situation as dire, and Thor isn't doing anything about that,
The humans slaughter each other in droves while you idly fret.
a problem which only calls for one solution, again per his reasoning in the prior scene.
I mean to rule them. As why should I not?
Thor slightly shakes his head as Loki says this, seeing what motivates him to think this way.
Don't think yourself above them.
Thor last movie gained a new appreciation of humanity and even the frost giants as no lesser than himself. Something Loki doesn't seem to understand, quite simply replying with,
Oh, yes.
confused that Thor would even ask that question. Thor sees the error in Loki's thinking because it's how he used to think, and it's exactly why Odin didn't let him become king and cast him out, leading him to fix his mindset. In the same way, he sees how Loki is not fit to rule if he thinks like this.
Then you miss the truth of ruling, brother. The throne would suit you ill.
Loki is angered at this statement and pushes Thor aside. What does Thor know of him, or of ruling, when Thor's just been sitting in Asgard all this time, whilst
I've seen worlds you've never known about.
he believes his experiences past Asgard have given him knowledge that led him to a more accurate perspective, unlike Thor's narrow, simple one. He follows up with a line that just perfectly exemplifies everything happening here.
I have grown, Odin's son, in my exile.
It shows how Loki sees Thor relative to himself since his wider experiences, having grown, while Thor, emphasized as Odin's son, lacks the same wider experiences due to staying on Asgard with Odin. Additionally, the biting tone with which he says,
Odin's son.
shows his disdain for Odin, for Asgard, and for being grouped in as Odin's son or Thor's brother. Furthermore, he specifically worded it as an exile, when nobody on Asgard made him leave or stopped him from coming back. This exile is another imagined slight, Loki's resentment twisting the events. He says,
I have seen the true power of the Tesseract.
as now, his main goal is to use this power to claim his rightful place as king, and is sure that he will be able to.
And when I wield it...
But Thor cuts him off with,
Who showed you this power?
a question Loki doesn't quite understand the intention behind, so he doesn't respond, leading Thor to ask more directly,
Who controls the would-be king?
showing that despite Loki's complete rejection of anything to do with Asgard, Thor still has the hope that this isn't truly Loki. Someone else must be influencing or manipulating him to become this resentful and power-hungry. Loki doesn't care about the question, but more about the wording of would-be king, Thor belittling him when he deserves to be king here, and unquestionably will take this position due to the power of the Tesseract.
I am a king!
But Thor tries one last time to put things in perspective.
Not here!
Earth is under his protection, and he's not going to let Loki take it over when he's so unfit to rule. He angrily demands,
You give up the Tesseract! You give up this poisonous dream!
as the power of the Tesseract and the allure of this dream to rule have clearly changed Loki for the worse, and Thor repositions his grasp to be less harsh as he finally makes a plea for Loki to come back, where he's meant to be.
You come home.
But instead of being touched by this display of how Thor still cares for him, Loki laughs and says,
I don't have it.
which is the last straw. If he's not taking that seriously, Thor doesn't see how he can be reasoned with and draws Mjolnir, giving up on appealing to Loki as if he has any semblance of the Loki he grew up with. But before he can strike, Loki lays out his leverage in this situation.
You need the cube to bring me home, but I've sent it off I know not where.
As it stands, Thor can't bring him home unless Loki cooperates and finds where those he controls brought the Tesseract. So he is at the mercy of Loki until he gets more information out of him. Thor is about to take charge of the situation,
Listen well, brother.
only for Iron Man to fly in and take him out, leaving Loki by himself to say,
I'm listening.
making light of the situation at every turn. This wasn't a comprehensive analysis. I'm sure I could find even more if I looked closer at these lines, because they're each just doing so much at once. The dialogue in this scene, and throughout the entire movie, is written with so much design and intention behind it. It's a perfect display of the benefits of a connected cinematic universe. The events, characters, and relationships from the first Thor movie are built off of to bring so much substance into this crossover movie that utilizes Loki as its main villain. This scene has a strong, dynamic back and forth between two well-developed characters. Thor, who is taking the situation seriously and has faith that Loki has good in him, and Loki, who jokes and mocks at every turn, turned unflinchingly rotten and unfeeling by his twisted view of how he was treated by his former family. It establishes, or in Loki's case, strengthens, their reasons for being in this movie, and fleshes out what's motivating each of them and where they're conflicting with each other. So much is done through this barely over 2-minute exchange. Here, the archaic language used more so by Thor, but certainly by both, doesn't detract from the efficiency of the dialogue. Words you wouldn't commonly hear, like muster, parentage, recompense, slights, droves, and so on, are used, but don't hinder it in any way. That's just how the people of Asgard talk. Dialogue is a powerful thing, and with great power comes great responsibility. Use it right, and your story can achieve tons of things at once. Use it wrong, and your story can achieve nothing, or even damage itself in multiple ways at once. Now that was one marvelous scene, but let's see how the Loki show makes use of its dialogue. I'm just going to remind you of the line that sent us on this tangent. Illusion projection involves depicting a detailed image from outside oneself, which is perceptible in the external world, whereas duplication casting entails recreating an exact facsimile of one's own body in its present circumstance, which acts as a true holographic mirror of its molecular structure. To me, this gives the energy of Lowkey speaks fancy. Let's do that. Without understanding how efficient his dialogue has always been, despite the fancy speaking. So much redundancy is thrown into this line to make it sound smarter, when, like I broke down before, even ignoring how the actual ideas presented are dubious at best, this line could have been way shorter and conveyed the same thing. And Mobius shouldn't have just let him keep going. They're on the clock here. The branch could hit redline any minute. The dialogue in this show is not very well written, especially in comparison to Loki's chronologically prior outing, and we'll continue to see that. Moving on, Mobius says that they're going to split into 2 teams, one of which includes Lowkey, as he is the expert here, considering the variant is also a Loki. As they're getting ready to go, Lowkey asks if he gets a weapon, to which the answer is no. And following that, he says,
I'll have my magic back. Is no one concerned about that?
Not a very mischievous move to remind them of your best chance to get away, when at this moment you have no reason to cooperate. Mobius somehow doesn't understand what he's hinting at, so he asks,
Of what?
So Lowkey spells it out for him.
Me betraying you.
Which is not a very trickstery move, laying this out as a possibility, rather than just doing it. Mobius says they're not concerned, because Lowkey already knows they can catch him, even though the entire reason he's here is that a Loki variant is evading the TVA single-handedly, so he likely could do the same if he got his hands on a tempad. But on top of that, Mobius asks,
How's betraying us going to get you any closer to the timekeepers?
which causes Lowkey to turn back and ask,
An audience with the timekeepers is on the table.
which is strange. There's no reason he'd particularly care about an audience with the timekeepers. He merely mentioned speaking to them in jest last episode, as an attempt of getting out of the trial. But all of a sudden it's genuinely motivating him. And despite his lack of trust in the TVA, he just believes without good reason that this genuinely could happen, and that they won't just prune him once his usefulness is exceeded because of their lack of trust in him. Lowkey asks a question so that we can get more exposition,
Why don't we just travel back to before the attack, when the variant first arrives?
which is a question a lot of people who criticize this show ask. I guess they missed this part because it was so quick, and because the explanation Mobius gives is,
Nexus events destabilize the time flow.
which just seems like random words, but he continues on,
This branch is still changing and growing, so you gotta show up in real time.
so meta time, which I talked about in my video on the second to last episode of the show. Events happening to the timelines and the TVA are restricted by a flow of time outside the time on the Sacred Timeline that they can travel to at any point. There is a progression of events at the TVA, and branches follow this progression at the same speed. This is why the TVA can't go back to before their problems were problems and fix them there. They have to deal with the branches at this current moment, which means going to its head and resetting it. I don't know why he called this destabilizing the time flow. It seems more like causing time to flow, but whatever. They bicker until we need more exposition, so a TVA agent randomly asks,
And what do these do?
about the reset charges. So Lowkey, as he learned in the training videos, explains,
Reset charges prune the affected radius of a branched timeline, allowing time to heal all its wounds.
so what it sounds like here is that it deletes everything in the affected area of the timeline, then time just somehow fills in that empty space? And this interpretation is backed up by what Lowkey says next.
Which, by the way, sounds like a nice way of saying disintegrate everything in its vicinity.
We'll see how well that explanation holds up. They enter the tent and see that C20 is gone. So B-15 notes that the variant took a hostage, to which the agent responds,
Or he pruned her.
which B-15 doesn't buy because,
A Loki couldn't have gotten the jump on C20.
even though taking her as a hostage also requires getting the jump on her. Also, they talk about how Lokis have largely different powers, so this statement is a bizarre thing to say. Given any number of powers, including the ones Lowkey normally has, or evidently the ones that the variant has, getting the jump on C20 would be quite easy. B-15 pulls out her tempad to reveal that the branch is 3 units away from the red line, so they all start walking away. Kind of silly to walk away when you have portals you could just create right next to where you're standing. And also, They wasted so much time before that they could come look for like 20 seconds, then have to leave for safety. Their process is really awful if all that preparation led to this little time to investigate. But as they walk away, Loki tries to make them think he is onto this variant's plan, and that they're waiting outside the tent to attack. His theory for the plan doesn't make sense, as if the variant was waiting for them outside the tent, they would have already gotten attacked either on the way in, or inside the tent, as that's the best place to sneak attack them. They don't believe that he's right about this variant's plan, so they reset the timeline and leave. We actually see what the reset charge does this time, which is not quite what Loki's explanation sounded like. It seems to do a sort of sweeping wave over the ground, and delete any objects it finds, or maybe not? If we're following Loki's explanation, it should delete everything, which in a way makes sense, as even the grass on the ground is changed by the variant's meddling, causing all these people to walk around here. But here, the grass and structure of the tent are unaffected. Only smaller objects are pruned, like lances and C-20's helmet and prune stick. So then, the next explanation you jump to is that it prunes anything that's not supposed to be there. Except there's these 2 random barrels that get pruned, even though they never came up. It seems like those barrels were just always there. They're never moved on screen, and there'd be no reason for the variant to move them either. So then, why don't these lances in the back get pruned? The writer's intention for how these work is confusing. Under either explanation that fits with what we're shown, the grass isn't pruned, so it doesn't make sense that the timeline would just go back to how it was. It's failing to reconcile certain things that were made different. And given the way it's supposed to work, the visual on the screen we see afterwards where the branch retracts into the sacred timeline is counterintuitive. It's fixing it in the present, so you'd think that the end of the branch would come towards the corresponding temporal point on the sacred timeline, then the branch would fold in from there. Yeah, I'm not sure exactly what they intended here. The cleanest way to have done it would be that the charge just deletes the entire branch timeline. And that's what some people thought is how it works, but that's not what the show was intending. Its effect is something more narrow, that the writers just intended to bring a branch timeline back in continuity with the sacred one, even if their way of executing it doesn't do that in any way that makes sense. We then have a conversation between Mobius and Renslayer that I'm going to skip over most of because it's not very interesting. It's just fine relationship building between these two, nothing especially impressive nor especially poorly written. But when Mobius is defending what happened on the mission, he says,
"Understanding this Loki helps me get closer to the one we're chasing."
Which is counterintuitive to the whole multiverse thing. He himself says,
"No two are alike."
Renslayer doesn't like this Loki being used because
Loki is an evil, lying scourge. That is the part he plays on the Sacred Timeline.
Which is not accurate considering who he becomes at the end of his journey, which the TVA knows about, but Mobius doesn't even argue that. He just says,
"Maybe he wants to mix it up. Sometimes you get tired of playing the same part. Is that possible? You can change?"
Acting as if it's some speculative thing for Loki to have a change of heart, not something they have definitive footage of. Mobius leaves, and Loki is waiting for him outside, and Loki, in typical trickster fashion, explains why he does what he does. Then when Mobius calls the variant superior, Loki gets offended, so Mobius says,
"I believed, stupidly, that insecure need for validation would motivate you to find the killer."
Which is a strange thing to give away, because Loki is very clearly trying to help you right now, and you just revealed your attempted method of manipulating him into doing exactly that. Meaning you can no longer manipulate him in this way, as he knows your game. Loki responds by saying,
"It is adorable that you think you could possibly manipulate me."
Then comes the massive reveal of,
"I'm 10 steps ahead of you. I've been playing a game of my own all along."
Strange to reveal that when you have not reached the goal of this deception, as Loki has not achieved anything yet, and Mobius sees right through his plan.
What, charm your way in front of the timekeepers, hustle them, and seize control of the TVA?
Loki made a pitiful job at hiding his plan, clearly becoming excited at a chance to meet with the timekeepers, and here just outright admitting that he was cooperating only as deception. Also, not sure how he plans to do that when, as far as he knows, The Timekeepers have a power level far above anything he could hope to beat. Mobius calls Lowkey a scared little boy here. This is important, as it will come up later. Mobius assigns Lowkey to desk work, looking through files so he can hopefully figure something out, noting that
The variant ambushed and killed another team of Minutemen. And stole their reset charge as well.
just the TVA being the ever-incompetent TVA, as usual. He goes to ask for files about the creation of the TVA, the beginning of time, and the end of time, but they're all classified. More on this way later. And he ends up with some files that contain a file on Ragnarok, and starts crying as he reads it. Now, you know from last video that I don't think him crying at the video makes sense with his prior character, but even that is more defensible than this. Because at the very least, that video included some people he cared about before that point. But at this point, he does not care at all about the people of Asgard, or Asgard itself. He hates Asgard at this point. That much is very clear from the scene I analyzed, and just the entirety of Avengers. Seeing on a piece of paper that it got destroyed, and a bunch of Asgardian civilians died, is not going to make him start crying. But then he realizes something. The paper says 0 variance energy. So he goes to tell Mobius about his finding. He says,
The answer isn't in the files, it's on the timeline.
As opposed to what? The variant is hiding in a filing cabinet? You found the answer through the files, and obviously they would eventually have to go to the timeline to deal with the variant. Anyway, Lowkey explains his theory.
He's hiding in apocalypses.
And uses Ragnarok as an example, to which Mobius says,
The destruction of Asgard and most of its people. I'm sorry.
And Lowkey, in direct contrast to himself 30 seconds ago, just goes,
Yes, very sad. Anyway,
and starts with,
Nexus events happen when someone does something they're not supposed to do, right?
which is what last episode said. And Mobius says that's the gist of it. Then Lowkey says,
And then that thing they're not supposed to do cascades into a whole range of other things that aren't supposed to happen.
and he's still making sense, that's the butterfly effect. But then he throws in,
And so on and so forth, until eventually a new timeline branches.
whoa, hold up. In episode 1, it seemed like Nexus event meant a new timeline being created, because, intuitively, any difference should make a new timeline. But now, Lowkey's saying that when a difference happens, it doesn't make a new timeline until it causes other differences to happen. Then, back to using Ragnarok as an example, he says that he could go back and alter it,
I could, let's say, push the Hulk off the Rainbow Bridge.
which is a terrible example because, no, you physically could not do that. He's much stronger than you. And also, that would not fit your theory, because many people, including Hulk, make it off of Asgard, leading these changes to lead to more changes afterwards. But ignoring the example, his exact wording for why changing things in apocalypses doesn't result in a new timeline is,
It wouldn't go against the dictates of the timeline.
even though it would. Part of the Sacred Timeline is Hulk not getting pushed off the Rainbow Bridge, but he thinks that because Surtur will destroy Asgard, that will supersede any changes he makes. I really hope Lowkey isn't correct. Just kidding, he is absolutely correct. Or at least, that's how it works in the show, even though it doesn't make any sense. Your mere presence in the Sacred Timeline would change it, making it no longer the same timeline. In Avengers, Thor the Dark World, and Guardians of the Galaxy, we didn't see the Avengers who traveled back in Endgame, because them simply arriving created a branch due to their presence not being a part of the past. A past that you intrude into is irreconcilable with the past that led up to where you traveled from, or in this show's case, it is irreconcilable with the future of the Sacred Timeline. So you're either overwriting it or creating a new timeline. And as is described in the show and in Endgame, you cannot change the past. Any change you make will only make a branched timeline. This rule seems to run off of the assumption that if you go back and change things in an apocalypse, once the apocalypse is over, there will be no observable changes, although that still should result in a timeline as I just described. But that assumption isn't even true. Apocalypses don't just delete all matter in the vicinity. There is stuff they leave behind, and you have now made changes to how that stuff ends up. The universe is different, and will have been different since the moment you arrived. Loki asks Mobius to bring him to a timeline to test that theory, so he does. They go to Pompeii in 79 AD, and nobody notices them despite their strange outfits. And Loki here is excited about the eruption happening and finds it cool. Mobius doesn't want him acting too giddy because he considers it not in good taste. To which Loki responds,
"Well, they're all gonna die anyway."
Which isn't important now, but we'll revisit it later. Mobius suggests that they start with small disturbances, but Loki is confident in his theory, so he goes and sets some goats free and speaks Latin to warn everyone of what's going to happen. Except, why would Loki know Latin if it's a language from some random backwater planet that became a dead language before he was even born? Well, anyway, Mobius sees that there is zero variance energy, just like Loki theorized. This whole zero variance energy thing doesn't make sense. They are varying the timeline, just in a very small way. It wouldn't be zero, and if it was zero for every apocalypse, how has the TVA never noticed this trend? They have people designated to the role of analyst.
You're not the only analyst working for me.
And yet, across the TVA's entire history, they haven't noticed this, even though Loki figured it out in, if we're being generous, a few hours? Not figuring that out would require a ridiculous lack of analysis. Also, Pompeii is a wonderful example of why this doesn't work. The changes Loki made would have caused the bodies to be laid out differently, meaning there is a persistent change to the timeline he made, as the archaeologists in the future would come across something different than they did in the Sacred Timeline, which should cause a branch, because now even past when him and Mobius leave, the timeline is different. Mobius afterwards says that this would only apply to events that are
Naturally occurring, sudden, no warning, no survivors.
But I don't get why any of that other than the last part is necessary. Under their assumptions, as long as no changes make it past the apocalypse, it should apply. This could be true of synthetic, long known about and warned about apocalypses too. Maybe they were so inevitable that despite a long heads up, nobody who observed what happened in it made it out. Well, anyway, this is the part where we actually entertain different headcanons, because the apocalypse rule is so nonsensical that people have tried to ignore what's established in the show to explain it. Basically, there's two different ideas for how the Sacred Timeline works. The first, and the one I think is better supported by the show, is that the Sacred Timeline is a loop, consisting of a single timeline that has already played out. We'll call this one the Sacred Timelone Headcanon. All of the visuals and nature of how they describe it seems to line up with this. It just has one big problem, alongside the apocalypse rule not working. Under this explanation, the Sacred Timeline doesn't play out because it is already there, but rather, branches spawn off of it due to tampering or random chance, and those are what play out. That's all well and good, except for the fact that this show is incited by Loki stealing the Tesseract in Endgame, which is caused by the Avengers traveling back as part of their intended Sacred Timeline journey. But for the Avengers to end up in the past, that would mean that the Sacred Timeline was actively playing out. So, yeah, under the explanation I think is most plausible, the existence of the show is a plot hole. So what if instead, we entertain a different headcanon? One that I subscribed to until rewatching the show and realizing that it really doesn't fit with what's established. But hey, maybe the characters are just wrong. I'm calling this one the Sacred Twineline Headcanon, and it postulates that instead of the Sacred Timeline being a single, already played out timeline, it's actually just a bundle of many timelines, each playing out in real time, following the same course at different offsets in time. So there's a timeline in the Sacred Timeline that has currently made it to 79 AD, and another that has made it to 2023, etc. to a very large degree. In this case, the apocalypse rule makes sense, because when you go to an apocalypse and make differences, your timeline is different from where it's supposed to be, but close enough to what all the timelines in the bundle are like, that the TVA can't detect it until more major differences happen. Off the bat, this theory, other than its nature as pure headcanon with no good evidence, seems to patch up a hole in the world building. But we'll come back to it when we talk about later events in the episode. After Mobius and Lowkey look through files for a bit, they go to talk in the cafeteria. The conversation leads to Lowkey questioning the story of Mobius, and everyone else is fed by the TVA. So Mobius starts asking Lowkey about his past, who his original parents are, and who raised him, then says it sounds just as ridiculous. Even though Lowkey lived through all of this, he would have very good reason to believe it's true, whereas Mobius has never even seen the Timekeepers, nor any evidence of actual power they have. But he just says he doesn't care about how believable any of it is, because it gives him his
glorious purpose.
And so he chooses to believe that it's real. Lowkey ignores the total straw man of an argument Mobius cooked up, and starts asking about what the end goal is, which leads nowhere, because what Mobius believes to be the case is just blatantly false, and from his point of view should be highly questionable, but whatever. I guess they'll explain that away with him saying he chooses to believe because it's easier. Then we get to one of the Lowkey quotes of all time. He starts by saying,
"You know, you called me a scared little boy."
Which is a strange thing to come back to, and wildly insecure to the point of being out of character. Mobius responds,
"I called you a lot of things."
Lowkey continues on by saying,
"You did. You're wrong, though."
Because I guess he's so insecure now that he can't stand someone calling him a scared little boy one time. And then, well, I'm just gonna let it roll.
You see, I know something children don't.
What's that?
But no one bad is ever truly bad.
But because that wasn't enough, he adds on,
And no one good is ever truly good.
Congratulations, Lowkey. You are not a child because you are aware that the concept of nuance exists. The quote is technically true, but it's not something above a child's understanding. And the fact that he even cares this much about being called a child is out of character. So I will never not make fun of this quote. And he's extremely serious when he says it. They really thought they were cooking with this one. Mobius repeats,
Scared little boy.
To which Lowkey replies,
Yes, it was quite patronizing. I thought it was a bit too far, actually.
Who is this guy? Like, seriously, why is Lowkey so upset over this insult that I'm not sure even reaches the height of playground level? They go back to get the gum that the child handed Mobius last episode. Lowkey asks,
What's that?
And Mobius responds,
Candy. Do you have candy on Asgard?
To which Lowkey responds,
Yeah, grapes, nuts.
This joke doesn't work, because Lowkey spent a significant amount of time on Earth, including messing around like being D.B. Cooper. He would understand the concept of traditional candy. And Mobius, who says
Okay, I've studied almost every moment of your entire life.
would know that. Mobius tells him,
Louis was only sold regionally on Earth from 2047 to 2051.
That's incredibly lucky. The gum that the child was given by the variant happens to be gum sold in a small amount of places over a relatively small amount of time. So they search through the apocalypses around that time, and Lowkey finds one apocalypse where the gum could have been gotten from, so they decide that's correct, and it's the place they're going to go. I don't know how they came to this conclusion when there were more apocalypses they didn't look through yet that also could have been candidates. But even assuming this is the one the gum came from, why would the variant go back? When you don't want to be caught, why go back to an apocalypse you left evidence behind for? Well, actually, why leave evidence behind in the first place? But assuming you already did, you obviously would want to use one of the many other apocalypses across the Sacred Timeline to hide in. Unless, of course, they left evidence behind as a trap, which Mobius and Lowkey should be suspicious of, because it's such a poor decision otherwise, and they are dealing with a Lowkey here. Mobius justifies it as making sense to Ravana, because
All the food and supplies you need, if he likes it there, there's no reason he can't keep going back and just camping out over and over.
except for the fact that if you left behind evidence that the TVA found, then there is a good reason to not go back and camp out. You could steal food and supplies from any range of large-scale apocalypses that the TVA doesn't have evidence to follow you for. Like maybe one that spans an entire populated moon? I'm sure in such a scenario, you could grab food from all kinds of places on that moon. Mobius says Lowkey is doing good, so Lowkey asks,
Good enough for a face-to-face with the Timekeepers?
He's not even trying to keep his intentions hidden at this point. They brief and then head to the timeline. We see that the winds are so strong, they tear apart an electronic billboard, and there are just random explosions everywhere. But somehow people are walking outside. And the TVA agents choose to portal in outside rather than inside the building. So they walk in. Lowkey dries himself with magic, which isn't really a part of his power set. Sure, he can change his clothes, but that's purely visual as far as I can tell. It never makes a physical difference. He says it was,
so I don't announce myself with every squeaky footstep like the rest of you.
Which is just lampshading. The TVA agents chose to portal in outside the building for no reason, then have no sort of tech to make themselves more stealthy, when they often would want to sneak up on a variant. B-15 and Lowkey go together, even though Mobius doesn't want that. And amidst the argument, Mobius says,
Try to hang on to your time collar this time.
Which made me realize, nobody trusts this Lowkey. Why don't they have a time collar on him anymore? Especially in the timeline, where he can use his magic and just kill B-15, take her tempad, then run off like the variant they're currently chasing after. This is even more of a problem now that he knows exactly where to hide so that the TVA can't find him. We see the variant setting an ominous 20-minute timer. Then Lowkey, despite the comment about squeaky footsteps earlier, is just yapping away while he walks with B-15. They run into a guy who is supposedly shopping because
it's a hurricane sale,
which makes them suspicious that he's the Lowkey variant they're after. And B-15 walks up to him, but for some reason doesn't prune him or slow him down, so he grabs her and possesses her. Lowkey asks,
me, I presume.
Then gets the response,
if anyone's anyone, you're me.
Which is just such an untrue statement that I don't know why this character would say that. You'll see what I mean later. Also, Mobius and the others found C-20, but that's not really important this episode. As Lowkey and possessed B-15 are walking around, this guy who's a total NPC comes up.
Hi, are you guys looking for the disaster shelter?
Then gets possessed. Lowkey starts bargaining with the variant, saying he'll overthrow the Timekeepers and allow this variant second position. But the variant declines, as they don't want to rule the TVA. Lowkey gets kicked by a new guy the variant possessed, so I guess the possessed bodies gain super strength? Then to fight back, Lowkey grabs a Roomba off a shelf. And by grab, I mean pull it to his hand with telekinesis. That's not a power Lowkey has. In his grief at Frigga's death, he did push things outwards, but that was more his magic going haywire because of an intense emotional state. After that point, it's not like he all of a sudden has controlled telekinesis. There are plenty of times where it would have come in handy and he would have used it if he did have it. And he definitely never showed anything like that up to 2012, and couldn't just pull it out of nowhere like this. We'd have to see him training it, which he most certainly could not do at the TVA, considering no magic works there. He asks,
"What do you want from me? What is this about?"
Which the variant plays on repeat, walks up, lifts their hood, and reveals that it's a female Lowkey. Now I'm confused as to what exactly a variant is. I thought it was the same person, but a different thing happened at a certain point in their life. But if someone was born differently and is genetically different, to me that seems like stretching the concept a bit. Well, anyway, she says,
"This isn't about you."
So there's unambiguous proof that, no, she was not intentionally leading them here. She just left Gum behind for no reason, then came back to this place specifically and stayed here, executing her plan here when they could have jeopardized it by showing up. I guess this was where she was storing all her reset charges, but she could have just moved them after realizing that the TVA has a way to find her after she left evidence behind? I guess the thought never occurred to her. After she says this, her ominous timer from earlier goes off, despite 20 minutes being an unbelievably long period of time for what we're shown. Let's do a quick sketch of the timeline, using Lowkey as our judge. Him and B-15 start walking together before the timer starts. Then there is some time they spend walking together off-screen, until they reach the plants, which I doubt would take particularly long, especially because this is the amount of time it takes until Lowkey starts speaking.
I, for one, am glad we get to spend this time together.
Then, he talks to the variant and B-15 gets possessed. There's a cut, then we come back to the comment,
"Enchantment is a clever trick."
so seemingly right after he saw B-15 get enchanted. The variant possesses the NPC guy. There's a cut between the variant saying,
"I'm not interested in ruling the time variant's authority,"
and Lowkey asking,
If you don't want to rule the TVA, then what do you want?
so again, seemingly picking up right where we left off. Then there's a fight, during which is our final cut. Before and after which, Lowkey is laying on the ground after getting knocked over. He was conscious, so it's not like he was laying there for an extended period of time. Then, after this, the timer goes off. The total on-screen time between this mostly continuous Lowkey point of view was about 6 minutes and 40 seconds. This means that all of these cuts had to have added up to 14 minutes and 20 seconds, when if we're being exceedingly generous, I'd estimate that there were maybe 5 minutes of off-screen time during these cuts, because they each pick up pretty much right after they left off. But I guess time passes differently here at the TVA. Oh, that excuse doesn't work here. So the timer going off makes a bunch of reset charges activate, then drop through many portals. There was no reason to spread them around the store like this. That only creates more work for yourself setting them all around these shelves, and then setting up that wiring, rather than just laying them out in a grid on the floor, then portaling them. They were sent to the Sacred Timeline, which results in a bunch of branches forming. And as I said earlier, what exactly reset charges do is confusing, but it certainly isn't this. The one common thread between all reasonable explanations for what they do is that they get rid of branches. They don't create them. If they delete what's not supposed to be there, then they would just delete nothing. If they delete everything and the timeline magically mends itself, the Sacred Timeline would just magically mend itself, and no branches would form. And seeing this guy frantically dialing in the numbers on his rotary phone is just hilarious. I know I already added an issue to the list for the TVA being low-tech, but with all the paperwork we see in this episode, and this hardware physically slowing this guy down from an urgent call when pushing buttons is easier to not mess up and is faster, the hacking excuse doesn't even work here. There's no disadvantage to having buttons or a touchscreen like the Temp-Pads do. I'm adding another issue to the list. Plus, he's flipping through some book while doing so, despite the people at the TVA having enough memory to know every language on the timeline. Surely he could have memorized the book if it was this important to his job. The lights in the supermarket turned red because it looks cool, I guess. The variant walks off through a portal, then Lowkey follows. If the variant left the portal open this long, surely she wanted him to follow, right? Then the episode ends. But we're not done, because now we have to talk about something the episode glosses over that is a major problem plot-wise. The TVA just ends up right where the variant is. Her name is Sylvie, by the way, so I don't have to keep saying this variant. And the TVA reaching her has different problems depending on which headcanon you're entertaining. So let's start with the Sacred Twineline Headcanon. If the Sacred Timeline is actually a bunch of identical timelines, then how did the TVA even find Sylvie? At best, they chose to travel here and got extremely lucky with ending up at the same timeline. And Sylvie had to luckily end up at the same timeline she was storing all the reset charges on every time she wanted to come back. Actually, come to think of it, Sylvie returning doesn't work, because assuming the Twineline theory holds true, because the individual timelines would play out in real time like branches do, Sylvie wouldn't pick up where she left off. She'll come back and everything will have gotten destroyed by the hurricane since she left. The latter part of this episode's plot just doesn't work under this headcanon, along with it not being how the timelines are described to work by the show, so I'm just going to deem this one head non-canon. So, the Sacred Timelone Headcanon. This one is just as, if not more problematic plot-wise, but it is how the show describes it to work, so it's the one I think is most viable to go with. Under this line of reasoning, Sylvie kept going to the Sacred Timeline, leaving reset charges and grabbing more supplies, then leaving. But it never caused a branch, because she didn't cause enough of a difference, meaning she could travel to right after she left last time, and continue changing it with her prior changes, like saving and loading in a video game, building up a store of reset charges. We're just going to have to assume that when you travel to the Sacred Timeline, you experience it in real time, because otherwise this gets a whole lot more confusing and broken. So Sylvie goes to the supermarket, stays for, let's say, 5 hours, then leaves. And the TVA would experience those 5 hours as well. It makes more sense how she kept returning to her stuff, but the problem comes when the TVA shows up. Let's say the TVA showed up a bit before the current point Sylvie is living out. This would make it so that they created a new Sylvie who is going to do different things than the Sylvie we were originally following, and both have a tempad and can leave, meaning we now have two Sylvies running around. Or, if they showed up significantly earlier when past Sylvie was there dropping off some reset charges, same thing. If they show up later than the point our Sylvie is at, they arrive to a moment without Sylvie. So the only way this episode could play out the way that it did is that the TVA arrived at the exact same infinitesimally small division of time that is the exact moment Sylvie was living out. A 1 over infinity chance, or basically 0. So yeah, the world building and plot of the episode, including but not limited to the red line, reset charges, and the apocalypse rule, fall apart under any headcanon. Just pick your poison. And by the way, this all relied on Sylvie traveling to the Sacred Timeline. Why can Tempads travel to the Sacred Timeline so easily? The TVA's job would never require this as far as they know. The Apocalypse rule is total news to them, and traveling to the Sacred Timeline is, again, as far as they know, a surefire way to cause a branch, which is exactly what they don't want to do. You'd think the Tempads would have some sort of safeguard against it, or maybe even lack the ability to travel to the Sacred Timeline entirely. I want to keep this video as brief as possible, so that's all I have to say for now. And as always, thanks for watching.